They're not perfect. Everyone is flawed. And so at some point, maybe you see too many of the flaws.
To think like an outsider requires basically two things. It basically means to take advantage.
We don't learn from people just by following their ideas.
And he realizes that this high mountain in Peru used to be underwater.
It's an ongoing process throughout your life. So who you glommed onto when you were 14 or 15 will change when you're 19. I had a series of people like you're talking about. My high school English teacher who had an enormous impact on me, who taught me basically how to write. I internalized his voice. When I went to Berkeley, I had a professor there who became my kind of surrogate father at Berkeley, who I deeply admired for his level of scholarship. So he became kind of an intellectual role model. Later in life, when I finally wrote my first book, I met a man, Joost Elfers, who was a book packager, who understood the business, etc. He kind of saved me. He was sort of my mentor for the next phase in my life. So on and on and on, I found people, but they have positive qualities that I admire. They're not perfect. Everyone is flawed. And so at some point, maybe you see too many of the flaws. You go on, I need somebody new in my life. But there's nothing wrong with that. It's not like you're violating any codes or hurting them. You move on to somebody else. But the sense of finding people whose qualities you admire, we don't learn from people just by following their ideas. We pick up their energy, their spirit. Now, you didn't necessarily pick up my energy or spirit from reading Master, although maybe you did, I don't know. But when you're interacting with that professor at Stanford or whatever, it's not just verbally, there's kind of a nonverbal communication going on. You're internalizing some of the positive qualities that you saw in them and finding these series of mentors, because I call it surrogate parents. You can't choose your father and mother, but you can choose these ideals for you. You can choose these mentors in your life. You can kind of rewrite your family history and find that father figure you never had by glomming onto this person. But it has to be the right fit. It has to be someone that you connect to emotionally and intellectually, and that has the positive qualities you wish for yourself.
Albert Einstein was a complete outsider. His two most important discoveries came when he was working at the Swiss Patent Office. Google itself exemplifies this idea. It is perhaps the most successful business on the planet, founded by two men who are relatively complete outsiders to business and who therefore structured and directed their company in a very novel and creative fashion. I could go on and on and on with this list, including many great artists. There are two important reasons why outsiders generally have a creative advantage. First, they are less steeped in and burdened by the conventions of the field that they are attacking. They ask a different set of questions. They approach problems from unconventional angles. And second, they are often trained in totally unrelated fields and so can make interesting and creative connections between two very different forms of thinking, like science and business, or chemistry and medicine, or engineering and design. Now, we can't all consciously follow such a path, but even within the careers that we're pursuing, we can train ourselves to think like outsiders and help loosen up the mind in the process. A great example of this would be somebody that I interviewed and profiled in my book, a contemporary master. Her name is Yoki Matsuoka. Yoki was one of the original heads of innovation for the Google X project. She is now the senior vice president in charge of technology at Nest Labs here in Silicon Valley. She was trained as an electrical engineer and roboticist, and early in her career, she was asked to help design the hand of a full-scale robot that was being developed at the MIT robotics lab where she was getting her PhD. Now, in the past, all of her fellow engineers basically attacked this idea of designing such a hand in the same way. They would place in this hand all sorts of very cleverly built motors that would give the hand maximum grasping power. They would load most of these motors in the palm because that's where there was the most space. But in packing the palm with all of these motors, they would render it completely inflexible, and so this hand could not make even the most simple grasping maneuvers. These hardware engineers would then fob off their design to software engineers, hoping that they could program back in the flexibility that they had lost. Hardware engineers are trained to think in a certain way. They're trained to think, to focus on the mechanical and technical aspects of a problem and stay within that circle. To speculate, to think of something wider or larger, would be too unconventional and would require too much work and effort. Well, Yoki decided on a much different approach. Thinking like an outsider, she asked the kinds of questions that other engineers ignored. She wondered about what made the hand so dexterous and powerful in the first place. How did it evolve into being so powerful? What is the role played by the palm in grasping objects, and how does it work in tandem with the thumb? Asking these larger questions made her extend her research to biology, neuroscience, evolution, biomechanics, and so on. She decided to build an elaborate model of the hand itself, including all of the tiny bones in the knuckles. In the process, she learned the importance of having a rounded, flexible palm and the role that certain bones play in grasping objects. Now, all of her fellow engineers scoffed at her method and the apparent waste of time that it represented. In the end, however, her outsider approach led to many more creative decisions. For instance, she decided to keep the palm rounded and flexible and place motors in different parts, substituting flexibility for power. In this way, her hand later on became the industry standard for prosthetics, one that was infinitely more lifelike and effective for users of this hand. Following this outsider approach, Yoki was able to avoid the ABC syndrome and that technical lock that stymied all of her other engineers. To think like an outsider requires basically two things. It basically means to take advantage of any training that you have had in any unrelated field, which almost all of us have had. It also means to take advantage of the incredible explosion of information that we now all have access to, and to expand your searches on any project to seemingly unrelated fields. By applying what you know from a different field, and by using this expanded research, you will naturally absorb and use different patterns of thinking. This will make you ask a different set of questions before you begin your project. So he's feeling like he's working for this madman. He's among all these sailors. He's missing his family. He's throwing up. What the hell did he do? But then he realizes there's nothing else. He can't get out of it. He's signed a contract and they left harbor. And also he wants to try and fit in. So he decides on this strategy. He's going to act like these sailors and this environment is just like nature. He's going to sit back and he is going to observe them as if they were plant and insect specimens. And he's going to try his hardest to learn the rules of what it's like to be a sailor, which basically means to do your job and don't complain and don't whinge and work harder than anyone else. And he's going to learn how to get along with the captain and feed his ego and talk about the Bible and do all these other things and just manage to fit in and be part of the group. So this strategy actually works, and several months later they arrive in South America. And as he gets off and he walks for his first day in South America, he sees the most insane thing he's ever seen in his life. A group of marching ants, like the width of this room, and going back hundreds of yards, and they're moving towards him and they're devouring every living thing in its path, including these small animals. And you know, they don't have things like that in England. So he's incredibly excited by what he's seeing in South America, but now he's starting to panic in another way. he realizes that none of his skills are suited for South America. He's learned these sort of how to collect the kinds of specimens and things that you have in England, but the variety of life here is so much more intense that he has to almost basically start over. He has to learn how to identify birds by their sound of their song, by the color of their eggs, by how they take flight and the sound that that makes, on and on and on. And there are hundreds of different bird species, and the same for all the insects and the plants. And to capture some of these animals required skills that he never had before. So instead of complaining or freaking out, he decides that he's slowly going to transform himself into the best collector. And the thing he realizes is that this was what he was meant to do. This was his life's task, because it's not like school. It's not like memorizing things. This is the real world, and it's really exciting. And the better he gets at it, the more fun it is. So slowly, Charles Darwin transforms himself from this sort of impatient young man who hates schooling into this incredibly diligent worker. And as the trip progresses, he starts to amass evidence of something weird going on this planet. He sees bones in a hillside that he manages to excavate, and they're of animals that are thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years old, obviously older than anything in the Bible. And so that starts him to question. He's trekking through these mountains, and the other thing about it is he becomes this incredible adventurer, trekking through all parts of South America and living with gauchos, and he has like no fear. He's trekking through the mountains of Peru, and he sees all of these marine plants, and he realizes that this high mountain in Peru used to be underwater. How could that have been? That also must have taken hundreds of thousands of years. Finally, at the end of this trip, he arrives at the Galapagos Islands, the story that we all know. And in 2 weeks, he sees this unbelievable variety of life that so clearly tells a story that fits in with the other things that he had been discovering, the theory that essentially is evolution and later natural selection. It all comes to him at that point, at the age of essentially 26 years old. He returns home, and the first thing that happens when his father sees him is he goes, "My God, your head looks larger. You're not the son that left here. You look completely different. You look serious." It's not Charles Darwin who left here 5 years ago. He never ends up leaving England for the rest of his life. He spends the next 30 years in his country house, essentially amassing evidence to prove the theory that he got when he was 26 on the island of Galapagos. Now, the reason I call this an iconic apprenticeship is the following. The goal of your apprenticeship is not to make money. It's not to get fame or to get attention or to get some cushy position with a nice title. The goal of your apprenticeship is to literally transform yourself. You enter the apprenticeship as someone who's essentially naive. There's no knock on it. We all do. You're essentially someone who doesn't have the skills that are necessary. You're probably someone who's a little bit impatient. Most young people are. And essentially, you are going to transform all of those qualities into someone who's skilled, who's realistic, who understands the political nature of people, who learns the rules that govern this field. And you're going to develop patience and a solid work ethic. I call it reality. This is reality. The reality is, in your field, for hundreds of years, people have been devising ways of success, procedures. These are the practices that have been passed through tradition. If you want, medicine would be an easy example, but it pertains to any field. That amount of rules and procedures represents reality.